Normandy, June 1944. British tank commanders are making a request that would shock military planners back in London. They're asking for American 75mm armed Shermans over their own British 17-pounder Fireflies. The same 17-pounder that could penetrate a Tiger tank at 2,500 meters. The same weapon that German tankers feared above all others. Why would British veterans, men who had faced Panthers and Tigers in close combat, reject the most powerful anti-tank gun in the Allied arsenal? The answer lies not in what the 17-pounder could destroy, but in what it couldn't. To understand this seemingly impossible decision, we need to understand what these weapons actually were. The American 75mm M3 gun mounted on the standard Sherman was, by 1944 standards, a thoroughly conventional weapon. Developed in the late 1930s, it fired a 75mm projectile at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,130 feet per second. Its armor-piercing capabilities were modest. At 500 yards, using standard armor-piercing ammunition, it could penetrate about 68 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at a 30-degree angle. Against the frontal armor of a Panther or a Tiger, it was essentially useless. But the 75 millimeters had one quality that would prove absolutely critical in Normandy: its high-explosive shell. The M48HE round carried 1.47 pounds of TNT. The British-made version carried 1.64 pounds of explosive filler. When that shell detonated, it created a blast effect that could destroy machine gun nests, suppress anti-tank guns, demolish stone walls, and scatter enemy infantry across the Norman hedgerows. Sherman tanks with the 75mm typically carried between 97 and 104 rounds of main gun ammunition. Only 10 to 15% of this was armor-piercing shot. The vast majority, 70 to 75%, was high explosive. Because encounters with German armor were relatively rare, but encounters with German infantry, anti-tank guns, and fortifications, those happened every single day. Now, the British 17-pounder. This was not a conventional tank gun. This was an anti-tank weapon forced into a tank turret through sheer engineering determination. The Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder was a 76.2mm gun, but that designation was almost meaningless. What mattered was the enormous cartridge case behind the projectile, nearly twice as long as the 75mm case, and significantly wider. This massive case held approximately 5.5 pounds more propellant than the American 75mm. The result: a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second with standard ammunition, with armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, 3,950 feet per second. At 1,000 meters, using APDS ammunition, the 17-pounder could penetrate 233 millimeters of armor. That's over 9 inches of steel. It could defeat the frontal armor of every German tank except the King Tiger, and even that monster could be penetrated through the turret face at 1,100 meters. German tank commanders feared the 17-pounder above all Allied weapons. They trained their crews to identify Fireflies by their distinctively long barrels, and to destroy them first, always first, before engaging any other target. So why didn't British tankers want them? The answer lay in a fundamental design compromise that British ordnance engineers had never fully solved. To achieve those incredible velocities, the 17-pounder generated chamber pressures that were extraordinarily high. This meant the shell itself had to be constructed with thick, strong walls to withstand the pressures during firing. Strong walls meant less internal volume. Less volume meant less explosive filler. The 17-pounder's high explosive shell, the MK1 variant, contained just 1.28 pounds of explosive. The MK2 contained only 1.06 pounds. Compare this to the 1.47 to 1.64 pounds in the American 75mm shell. That's a difference of 20 to 35% less explosive power. But the problem went deeper than just numbers. The 17-pounder's HE round had to be fired at reduced velocity to prevent the shell from fragmenting in the barrel. Even at this lower velocity, the shell's thick walls meant that when it detonated, it produced fewer fragments. Less blast effect. A smaller kill radius against infantry and soft targets. In testing conducted in late 1944, the British Ordnance QF 75mm, a British modification of their 6-pounder gun to fire American 75mm ammunition, was found to have the most effective HE shell of any Allied tank gun of similar caliber. better than the 6-pounder, better than the American 3-inch gun, and significantly better than the 17-pounder for tank crews supporting infantry attacks in Normandy. This wasn't just a technical detail on a specification sheet. This was life and death. Let me paint you a picture of what infantry support actually meant in the Norman bocage. The hedgerows of Normandy were ancient, some dated back to Roman times. They consisted of thick earthen banks, 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense thorny vegetation and mature trees. Between these banks ran sunken lanes, narrow tracks where centuries of traffic had worn the ground down below the level of the surrounding fields. This terrain created thousands of small compartments, each one a potential killing ground. German defenders occupied these positions in depth. Machine gun teams in reinforced dugouts, mortar crews in defilade positions, anti-tank guns sighted to cover every approach. When British infantry attacked, they needed their tanks, not to fight other tanks, but to destroy these prepared positions. A 75mm Sherman could pump out high explosive shells at a rate of 20 rounds per minute, each shell carrying enough explosive to collapse a dugout, shred a machine gun position, or blast a hole through a stone wall for the infantry to exploit. The 17-pounder Firefly, with its inadequate HE round, was far less effective in this role. Worse, the 17-pounder created its own tactical problems. The muzzle blast was enormous. Ken Tout, who served as a gunner and tank commander in the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, described it vividly. The flash was so brilliant that both the gunner and commander had to blink at the moment of firing, or they would be blinded for several seconds, unable to observe where the shot had hit. The muzzle flash, spurting flame like a blowtorch, would set fire to hedgerows and undergrowth. After just 2 or 3 shots, the position would be marked by burning vegetation, revealing the Firefly's location to every German anti-tank gun in range. And remember, German crews were trained to target Fireflies first. That long barrel made identification easy. That massive muzzle flash made targeting easy. A Firefly that fired its main gun more than a few times from one position was a dead Firefly. The British Army recognized these limitations and developed a doctrine to work around them. In a standard British armored squadron in Normandy, each 4-tank troop included 1 Firefly and 3 standard 75mm Shermans. The ratio, 3 to 1. The 75mm tanks were to handle the vast majority of combat situations. Infantry support, destroying soft targets, suppressing anti-tank positions. The Firefly was held in reserve as a tank killer. Its job was simple: wait, remain concealed, and when a German Panther or Tiger appeared, strike with devastating effect, then immediately displace before German return fire could find it. This doctrine made perfect sense on paper. In practice, the realities of combat made it far more complicated. After-action reports from the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, document the problem clearly. Tank commanders and infantry support roles found themselves constantly requesting additional 75mm armed Shermans. The Fireflies and their troops were valuable, irreplaceable when facing German heavy armor. But for the daily grind of combat in the bocage, they were frustratingly limited. British Lieutenant Colonel Cromwell tanks and Churchill tanks faced the same problem. When the British Ordnance QF 75mm was introduced, essentially a reboard 6-pounder firing American ammunition, tank crews embraced it enthusiastically, not because it was better against tanks. The 6-pounder's armor penetration was actually superior, but because it gave them an effective HE shell. The 14.9-pound British 75mm HE shell, fired at 2,150 feet per second, was described in British evaluation reports as the best available high-explosive round in its class, superior to the 17-pounder, superior to all other comparable weapons. Some British units in Italy and Normandy actually retained 6-pounder armed tanks alongside their 75mm tanks. The 6-pounder was a better anti-tank weapon than the 75mm, especially when using APDS ammunition. But the 75mm was vastly better for infantry support. Units kept both because they needed both. The 17-pounder faced a more fundamental problem. It couldn't be both. It was superb at one mission, destroying enemy armor, and inadequate at everything else. Let's talk about what tank crews actually encountered in Normandy. German armored strength in the theater was significant, but concentrated in specific units. The Panzer Lehr Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the elite heavy tank battalions with their Tigers and King Tigers. But the vast majority of German units were infantry divisions, parachute divisions, static defensive divisions. These formations had no tanks. What they did have, in abundance, were anti-tank guns, dug in, camouflaged, supported by infantry. These positions were the daily reality for Allied tank crews. A British Sherman crew in Normandy might go days or even weeks without seeing a German tank, but they would encounter German anti-tank positions every single day. The Pak 40 75mm anti-tank gun was the standard German weapon. Roughly 20,000 were produced during the war, more than all German tank destroyers combined. These guns were sighted in depth, mutually supporting, often in positions that were invisible until they opened fire, and when they did open fire, the tank's only response was to suppress them with high explosive shells, quickly, before they could destroy the tank or kill the supporting infantry. A 75mm Sherman could lay down a devastating volume of HE fire, 20 rounds per minute, each one with enough explosive power to destroy a gun position, or at least force the crew to take cover long enough for friendly forces to maneuver. A Firefly, with its weak HE shell, required multiple hits to achieve the same effect. And every shot revealed its position with that massive muzzle flash. The ammunition loadout reflected these tactical realities. A 75mm Sherman carried 90 to 104 rounds, only 10 to 15% armor piercing, the rest high explosive, with maybe 10 to 15% white phosphorus smoke rounds. Smoke was critical. WP rounds started fires, created concealment, and were psychologically devastating to enemy infantry. The 75mm WP round was highly effective. The 17-pounder could barely justify carrying HE ammunition at all. Most Firefly crews maximized their armor-piercing loadout because that was their mission, tank killing. But this meant that in the vast majority of combat situations, the 75mm Sherman was the more useful weapon, which is exactly what those after-action reports from the 7th Armored Division documented. The British were well aware of this problem, and they attempted to solve it, but engineering reality kept getting in the way. In late 1944, an improved HE shell for the 17-pounder finally reached the field. This round was fired at lower velocity and had been redesigned to provide better fragmentation. It was an improvement, but it still couldn't match the 75mm's effectiveness. The fundamental problem was physics. To achieve the 17-pounder's incredible armor penetration, you needed high velocity. High velocity required high chamber pressure. High pressure demanded thick shell walls. Thick walls limited explosive capacity. There was no way around this compromise. The Germans faced exactly the same problem with their long-barreled 75mm and 88mm guns. Excellent against armor, mediocre for infantry support. German tank units often included specific close support vehicles, assault guns and infantry tanks with larger caliber, lower velocity weapons specifically for HE fire. The British attempted something similar with the 95mm howitzer, mounted in close support versions of the Churchill and Cromwell tanks. These were effective, but relatively rare. There were never enough of them. The American solution, ironically, was perhaps the most practical. Keep the reliable, well-supplied 75mm Sherman as the standard tank, use it for infantry support and general-purpose combat, and deploy the 76mm armed Sherman and the M36 tank destroyer in smaller numbers for anti-armor work. The British created the Firefly because they needed the 17-pounder's firepower, and they needed it mounted in a tank chassis that was reliable, available in quantity, and could be maintained with existing supply chains. The Sherman was perfect for this, except that the resulting vehicle was narrowly specialized, brilliant at killing tank, barely adequate at everything else. By early 1945, with better HE ammunition available and German armor becoming increasingly rare, some British units were receiving 2 Fireflies per troop instead of 1. The 50-50 mix of 75mm and 17-pounder tanks became more common, but this change came late in the war, when the Comet tank, with its 77mm gun that was essentially a shortened 17-pounder, was entering service. The Comet had better HE performance than the standard Firefly, though still not as good as the 75mm. The ideal solution, the Centurion tank with proper turret design for the 17-pounder and adequate HE ammunition. Entered service too late to see combat in World War II. So, why did British tank commanders request American 75 millimeter Shermans over their own 17-pounder Fireflies for infantry support? Because warfare is not just about what you can destroy, it's about what you need to destroy and how often you need to destroy it. The 17-pounder could penetrate any German tank in Normandy, but German tanks were rare. German machine gun nests were everywhere. German anti-tank guns were everywhere. German infantry in fortified positions were everywhere. The 75 millimeter Sherman, with its excellent HE ammunition, its high rate of fire, and its reliable, proven design, was the right tool for the vast majority of combat situations British tankers actually faced. The Firefly was essential. Don't misunderstand. When that Panther appeared on the horizon, when that Tiger rounded the corner, you needed that 17-pounder. Your life depended on it. But for everything else, for the daily grind of combat in the Norman bocage, for supporting the infantry as they cleared village after village, hedgerow after hedgerow, machine gun nest after machine gun nest, the humble American 75 millimeters was the weapon you wanted. This wasn't a failure of British engineering. The 17-pounder was a masterpiece, one of the finest anti-tank guns ever created, but it was an anti-tank gun, forced into a role, infantry support, for which it had never been designed. The British tankers who requested 75 millimeter Shermans understood something that armchair historians sometimes forget. In war, the best weapon is not always the most powerful weapon. The best weapon is the one that matches your mission. And in Normandy, that mission was usually infantry support, not tank killing. The 17-pounder won the tank versus tank battles, but the 75 millimeter won the war. One hedgerow, one machine gun nest, one anti-tank position at a time. British tank crews knew this. Their after-action reports documented it, and their equipment requests reflected it. Sometimes. The most important question isn't, can this weapon destroy a Tiger tank? Sometimes the question is, can this weapon destroy what I'm actually going to fight today? And in Normandy, the answer to that second question, more often than not, was the American 75 millimeters. If you found this examination of historical tactics interesting, please consider subscribing to our channel. We explore the details of military history that often get overlooked in simplified narratives, the small decisions, the practical considerations, the realities that soldiers and commanders actually faced. Thank you for watching.